Timeless Tales, a fable from Aesop by way of medieval England, Belling the Cat. Long before the world had rooms with locks, in a great old house at the edge of a village whose name has long been forgotten, there lived a colony of mice. The house was built of grey stone and oak beams, and its kitchen, large enough that a horse could have stood in the center with room to swing its tail, had a larder that ran the length of one wall. The larder was a wonder. Sacks of flour from the autumn milling, wheels of cheese hung from hooks beneath the rafters, apples kept whole in barrels of straw, smoked sausages in long ropes, pots of honey sealed with cloth and wax, a jar of dried plums whose lid the mice had not quite worked out, but which they knew would yield in time to patience. The mice had lived in the walls of this house for as long as any mouse could remember, and many of them had been born in the same loose floorboard their grandmothers had been born in. Their lives, by the standards of mice, were good. They had a council that met every fortnight in the room behind the cellar steps. They had a school for the very young, where old Greyhide, who had survived 7 winters and the tale of 3 different cats, taught the first lesson every mouse learns, that the world is bigger than your fear and smaller than your hope. They had songs and stories and a great deal of cheese. They had, until the spring of the year this story takes place, only one trouble in their lives, and that trouble, like most troubles, was something they had grown so used to that they had stopped seeing it clearly. The trouble had a name, and its name was Tiber. Tiber was the cat of the house. He was a great grey and white tom with a tail like a banner, and eyes the color of a winter sky, and he had been a kitten when most of the older mice were already grown. He moved through the house with a silence so complete that even the floorboards he walked on seemed to forget he was there. He hunted at night and he dozed by the hearth in the daytime, and his patience was the kind of patience that looks, from the outside, very much like luck. The mice had developed, over the generations, a folklore around the cat. The youngest pups were taught his name as a kind of weather. Do not go above the cellar steps when Tiber is on the 2nd floor. Do not pass through the drawing room when his eyes are open. Do not run on the kitchen tiles after the sun has set. The teachings were specific and they were honest, and they had kept the colony's losses in most years manageable. There were always losses. A pup here, an old mouse there. The colony had a small ceremony for each, held in the chamber behind the cellar steps, where old Greyhide would say a quiet word, and the family would lay a single grain of rice on the ledger stone where the names of the lost were scratched. Most years there were 8 or 9 names. The year this story takes place, by the spring there were already 11. By the 3rd week of March there were 14. By the day of the council we are about to enter, there were 17. The ledger stone had begun, for the first time anyone could remember, to look full.
3 more this week, 3, old Boren's grandson on Tuesday, Selma's brother, and the new young one whose name I had not even learned. We cannot keep going like this. I will not keep burying the young. There has to be something. There has to be some way.
His name was Marin, and he was 19 weeks old, which is to say he was old enough to remember the previous winter, and young enough to believe it should not happen again. He stood now in the middle of the council chamber, the long-disused servant's pantry whose door had warped enough years ago that no human had thought to repair it, and he was speaking, for the first time in his life, to all the elders of the colony at once. The chamber was lit by the soft greenish glow that comes off old beeswax candles when their wicks have grown long, and the air smelled, as it always did, of dust and apples and faintly of fear. Around Marin sat 72 mice, more than half of all the mice in the house, and as he spoke, the silence that grew in the room was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of a great many minds arriving, slowly, at the same conclusion he had already reached. The chamber had been the colony's council room for 14 generations. Its walls bore the small chip marks of every leader who had stood in its center and said something the room remembered. The ceiling had a knot in the wood that resembled, in certain lights, the face of a mouse. The mice had named the knot Old Stone-Eye, and a tradition had grown that no important decision was made until Old Stone-Eye had been looked at in silence by every elder present. Marin, who had never stood in the chamber's center before, had not yet looked at Old Stone-Eye. He stood in the center now, and his eye was on the candle, not the ceiling, and the elders, watching him, watched for the moment when he would remember. Above their heads, 3 floors up, in a wing of the house the mice rarely entered, the cat Tiber was sleeping. He was curled in a window box on a cushion of rose-colored silk, and the late afternoon sun was warming his fur. He did not know there was a council. He did not know his name was being said. He did not, in any sense the mice would have understood, know about them at all. He simply hunted when he was hungry and slept when he was not, and the difference between his sleeping and his hunting was a thing the mice could not predict, no matter how carefully they watched.
He does not know us, he does not need to. He moves and we die, and he never even thinks of us as people. We have to know him. We have to make him a thing we can hear coming. There must be a way.
And here at the heart of the council, the great difficulty became visible. Many mice spoke. Old Marin, whose grandson had been taken on Tuesday, spoke of the days when their grandmothers had hidden during a cat's reign by simply moving the colony to the wine cellar, but no mouse younger than 15 winters could remember any colony moving anywhere. And the wine cellar, when scouts had checked it that morning, had a family of weasels in it now, and the weasels were a different kind of trouble. A mouse called Eloin, who had read every label on every jar in the larder over a period of 3 winters, and who could therefore claim a kind of bookish authority, suggested that they study the cat's habits more carefully. He said that they should map his hunting routes and his sleeping places and his preferred hours, and that they live, around those maps, the small careful life of mice who knew the geometry of their predator. There was nodding. There were murmurs of approval. But Eloin had been studying the cat's habits for 2 winters already, and the colony had still lost 3 this week, and even Eloin admitted, when pressed, that maps did not save you on the mornings the cat decided to vary his route. A young mouse called Tess, who was small for her age and had a steady voice that was entirely out of proportion with her size, suggested that they try to make peace with the cat. She said they should find a way to leave him offerings of food, that they negotiate mouse to cat, the terms of their cohabitation. The room laughed. Tess sat down. The room realized, a moment later, that it had laughed at a child, and the laughter became a kind of quiet shame that was harder to dispel than the laughter itself had been. Old Greyhide, the schoolteacher, said gently that the cat would eat the offering and then eat the mouse who brought it, because that was the nature of cats. Tess did not look up. A mouse called Bran proposed that they fight. He said that if they all attacked the cat at once in a great wave, they could overwhelm him by sheer numbers. There were 37 mice in the colony big enough to bite, he said. The cat had only 4 paws and 1 mouth. The mathematics, said Bran, was on their side. The mathematics was not on their side, and several older mice said so, kindly. The cat had killed 3 this week without effort. A wave of mice would feed him for a fortnight. A mouse called Narret, who was nearly the same age as Marin and who had been sitting near the back, said that they should build something. He said there were materials in the larder, corks, threads, pieces of wire from a fallen picture that could be combined into a kind of trap. A pit perhaps lined with sharpened nails, a spring-loaded plate, something the cat would step on and that would, by force or deception, end him. The room listened. Several of the older mice exchanged looks. Old Greyhide said gently that the cat had survived 3 previous traps, set by previous generations of mice, all of which had been clever in their conception and useless in their execution. The cat learned. The cat had always learned. The trap that killed a cat was the trap that the cat did not see, and a trap that the cat did not see required a cat that was inattentive, and Tiber had not been inattentive in 7 years. Narret sat down. A mouse called Illa, who was older and had been a sentry in her younger days, suggested simpler vigilance. She said they could rotate watches, post mice at every entry to the colony's main passages, sound the alarm at every approach. The chamber considered it. Several mice nodded. But old Marin, who had lost his grandson on Tuesday, said very quietly that they had been keeping watches for 6 months already, and that his grandson had been killed 5 paces from his sister, who had been on watch and had not been able to call out fast enough. The watch was not a plan. The watch was what they did between plans. Illa accepted this. She did not sit down so much as fold slowly into the place she had been standing. Late in the evening, a mouse called Pelin, who was older than Bran but younger than old Greyhide, proposed that they leave. He said that the house had served them well for many generations, but that no house was the only house in the world. There were other houses. There were stables, there were granaries, there was the open country in summer. The colony could pack what it could carry and walk by night to a different home. The proposal was the most radical of the evening, and many mice were taken aback by it. But the more they thought about it, the heavier the objections grew. The granaries had cats too. The open country had owls and foxes and an open sky. The other houses had their own colonies of mice, and 150 newcomers would not be welcomed. The plan, like the others, dissolved under the weight of the world's unfriendliness. For nearly 2 hours, the council went on like this. Every proposal had a flaw. Every flaw was visible to everyone except the mouse who had proposed it. Marin, listening, found himself caught in a strange double awareness. He could see very clearly that each speaker was wrong. He could also see just as clearly that each speaker was being honest, that the flaw in their proposal was not a flaw of dishonesty or laziness, but a real and specific gap in their plan that they had not seen until the room had pointed it out. He had begun to suspect, with a quiet dread, that his own initial certainty had been of exactly the same kind. He had been certain there was a way. He was now in a room of certain mice whose certainties were collapsing, in turn, like dominoes. The dominoes had been falling for hours. Several of them had fallen on his own foot. Marin, who had begun the conversation, sat in the center of the room and watched the proposals pile up and then collapse one after another, and felt his certainty draining slowly out of him. He had been so sure 2 hours ago that there had to be a way. He was beginning now to wonder whether there was.
Listen, listen. That's him. He's awake, he's on the second floor. Quiet now, all of you. He is moving. He's coming down the back stair.
There was, however, one mouse who had not yet spoken. He was very old. He was older even than old Greyhide. His name was Taro, and he had once been the leader of the colony when their fathers had been pups, and he had retired to a small chamber of his own behind the wainscoting many seasons ago. He came to council rarely now. He listened. He waited. And when, after the long debate had ended in nothing, and the room had fallen into a tired quiet, Taro rose to his feet, every mouse in the chamber turned toward him. He spoke softly. He said, "The cat hunts in silence. That is what makes him terrible. If we could hear him coming, if every step he took rang a small bell that we could hear from anywhere in the house, he would not be able to hunt at all. He could enter no room without warning us. We could move every time before he was upon us. The cat with a bell is not a cat. He is a noise."
Yes, that's it. That's exactly it. We tie a small bell to a cord and we put it around his neck, a small bell, bronze, copper, anything that rings. The moment he moves, we hear him. The moment he steps into a room, every mouse in the house knows. He cannot hunt what cannot be surprised. He cannot kill what hears him coming. We're saved. We're all saved, every single one of us. We tie a bell on the cat. We tie a bell on the cat.
For perhaps 3 full seconds after Marin finished speaking, the council chamber filled with the kind of relief that comes only after a long fear has met what feels like its solution. Mice clapped, mice cheered, the young ones embraced, old Borin wept. Eloin, the bookish one, was already in his head designing the harness, calculating the weight of bell that a cat could be made to wear without immediately tearing it free, the kind of cord that would not rot in summer, the size of the chamber needed to forge such a thing. And then at the back of the room, a single mouse, a quiet old mouse called Hesp, who had said nothing all evening, raised his small grey paw, and the sound of celebration began, very gradually, to thin. Hesp said, "Who exactly will tie the bell?" The chamber went silent. Marin, who had been laughing, stopped laughing. He looked instinctively at the older mice. The older mice looked at the younger mice. The younger mice looked at each other. No mouse looked at Hesp. After a moment, every mouse in the chamber was looking at the floor. A young mouse called Marin, who had been the first to cheer, found his voice first. He said that he would gladly do it, gladly, were it not for his 3 pups at home, who were 8 weeks old and who could not yet feed themselves and who would starve without him. The chamber understood. No one asked Marin to volunteer. Marin sat down. A mouse called Idra, who had been the loudest in the cheering, said that she had a damaged ear from a falling jar 2 springs ago, and that the damaged ear meant she could not, with any reliability, judge the distance to a sleeping cat. She would of course have done it otherwise. She did not look at anyone as she spoke. She sat down. A mouse called Vel, who was younger and stronger than most mice in the room, said that his mother had only him and would not survive the loss. The chamber understood. Vel sat down. Bran, who had earlier proposed the great wave of attack, said that he was a fighter, not a sneak, and that the bell required stealth, which was not in his nature. He could be the second mouse, he said. He could rush in to help if the bell tier was caught. He could not be the first. Eloin, the bookish one, said that his eyes were too poor for the work, that he could read at close range but had trouble seeing more than 3 poets ahead, and that this would be a fatal handicap on a stair landing. He was sorry. He sat down. Old Greyhide, the schoolteacher, said quietly that he was an old mouse, but that the colony's children needed their teacher, and that without him the next generation would grow up not knowing what to fear. He said this in a voice that was very even and very controlled, and many mice did not look at him as he said it. A mouse called Wes, who was strong and capable and had no family to lose, said that he would gladly do it, but that he had, and here he hesitated, and the chamber waited, that he had a fear of heights. The cat slept on the upper floors. The bell would have to be tied while the cat was sleeping, and that meant climbing. He could climb the walls inside the colony, certainly, but the cat slept on cushions on bookshelves and on the high mantelpiece in the drawing room, and Wes did not trust himself in the moment of the cat's first stirring not to lose his footing. He looked at the floor for a long moment after he said this. The chamber, which knew Wes, did not press him. Wes sat down. A mouse called Jorel, the colony's grainkeeper, said that the larder could not afford to lose him. He had been the grainkeeper for 9 winters. He knew which sacks were going stale and which jars had been compromised by moisture, and which ropes of sausage had been hung too low for the cat's reach and which had been hung correctly. Without him, the colony's food would deteriorate within a season. The chamber understood. Without food, the colony was lost as surely as it was lost to Tiber. Jorel sat down. A mouse called Myra, who was very young and who had volunteered, the moment Hesp's question was asked, with a clarity that startled the room, was talked down by her own mother. The mother stood beside her and held her paw and said, very quietly and with a control that did not waver, that Myra was 12 weeks old, that she had not yet finished the school's basic course, that she did not know enough about cats to do what was being asked, and that the colony did not send children to die. Myra protested. Her mother did not argue. She simply stood, holding her daughter's paw, and looked at the room. The room did not, in the end, ask Myra to volunteer. For perhaps 2 minutes after Myra sat down beside her mother, the chamber did not speak. The candle had burned low enough that its flame was now horizontal in the draught, and the greenish glow had given way to steadier amber. The mice in the small cluster near the candle, the ones with no family to lose, no special skill to save, no excuse, sat very still. They did not any of them raise their paws. A young mouse near them, who had no excuse either but who had not yet been counted among them, stood up and walked, slowly and with great deliberation, across the room to join their cluster. The chamber watched her cross. No one stopped her. No one accompanied her. By the time she sat down, the cluster had grown by one mouse, and the silence had grown larger than the cluster. It was not hostile, the silence. It was simply the silence of a room that had run out of things to say. The excuses continued. Each one was reasonable. Each one was, on its own merits, true. The chamber heard each excuse and accepted it, and as each excuse was offered and accepted, the proposal that had so recently saved them all began, very quietly, to die. After perhaps an hour, the chamber had run out of mice with reasons to refuse. The remaining mice, the smallest, the very oldest, the ones with no family to lose and no special skill to save, sat in a small cluster near the candle. They did not any of them speak. They had no excuse. They had also not volunteered.
It is a fine plan. It is, perhaps, the finest plan this council has ever entertained. But we have no one. We have 1,000 reasons and not one volunteer. The plan is, therefore, no plan. It is a wish. We have made many wishes here tonight. We have made no plan.
The council ended without resolution. The mice dispersed in small groups, walking home through the walls, and each of them, even those who had spoken proudly that evening, went to their nests and looked at their families and felt in different ways the same quiet shame. The cat slept on. The next morning he hunted. By the end of the week, 2 more mice were missing. By the end of the month, the colony had moved its sleeping quarters once again, this time to the smaller, less convenient chamber behind the cellar steps, where the cat had not, so far, gone. The bell was never tied. The proposal was never executed. The plan that had saved them all in the moment of its first telling saved no one in the months that followed. And yet every council the colony held thereafter, for as long as Marin lived, returned to the bell. They debated it. They refined it. They never, in all those years, found anyone willing to climb the cat. Marin, in the years that followed, became one of the colony's elders. He sat in his time in the seat that Taro had once sat in. He spoke when he spoke, with a measured care that the older mice had come to recognize as the residue of the night the bell was proposed. He never, in all his life, suggested another plan he was not himself prepared to execute. He never asked anyone else to do a thing he would not do. This was, in the colony's later memory, the small private rule he carried out of the council chamber. It did not save the colony. The cat continued. Other mice were lost. But it was, perhaps, the only thing the council had truly produced that night. We live now in an age that has a great many councils. The councils are larger than the one in the wainscoting. They meet in conference halls and they publish their proceedings, and they are attended by people whose names are widely known. The cat in our story has, in our age, a more abstract form. It is the artificial intelligence systems being trained in laboratories around the world, systems whose abilities increase faster than our agreements about how to govern them. The bell in our age has been called many things: alignment, oversight, interpretability, accountability. Each of these is a real proposal. Each of them in council draws applause. The mechanism by which these proposals fail to be executed is, in its essential shape, the same mechanism that emptied the chamber in the larder. The work of belling the cat, the work of actually slowing a system, of imposing real friction on the people who profit from its speed, of being the team or the country or the company that goes first while the others move ahead, is work that always belongs to someone else. There is always a reason. The reason is always honest. Each laboratory cannot afford to be the laboratory that pauses. Each country cannot afford to fall behind. Each board has its fiduciary duty. Each researcher has the family they support and the career they have built. The excuses are real. The cat is also real. The cat does not stop hunting because we have voted that it should. This is not a story about the impossibility of action. It is a story about the gap between agreement and action, and the gap is the place where the cat lives. The mice who proposed the bell were not weak. The mice who refused to tie it were not cowardly. They were, every one of them, accurately calculating their own risk. The colony's failure was not the failure of any one mouse. It was the failure of the colony to find a way to assign the risk so that no single mouse had to bear it alone. We have not yet in our age found that way. The conferences continue, the papers proliferate, the cat learns. The shape of the failure is what is worth dwelling on. It is not that anyone in the council is wrong. The mouse who cannot leave her young is not wrong. The laboratory that cannot afford to pause is not wrong. The country that will not be the first to slow down is not wrong. Each of them in isolation is making the rational choice from inside their own life. The failure is structural. It is the failure of a system that requires individual sacrifice for collective benefit, in a context where every individual can correctly point out that no one else is sacrificing either. Game theorists have a name for this shape. The mice in the larder did not. They simply went home. We, having a name for it, have so far done the same. There are, however, a few things that follow from naming the shape. The mice who eventually do something about a cat are rarely the strongest mice. They are the mice who decide that the calculation of personal risk is no longer the only calculation that matters. They do not pretend the risk is not real. They do not pretend their own lives are not their own. They simply choose, for reasons that often look small from the outside, to be the ones who go near the cat. In our age, that choice is being made too by the researchers who walk away from labs whose pace alarms them, by the engineers who insist on slower releases at companies that prefer faster ones, by the policymakers who propose rules they know will be unpopular, by the boards that vote for friction when the market wants speed. They are not heroic, mostly. They are not loud. They are simply the mice in the cluster near the candle who, after a long silence, stand up. There is a question worth carrying away from this story. It is the same question Hesp asked, very softly, at the back of the chamber, after the cheering had begun. Who exactly will tie the bell?
It is easier to propose a hard thing than to be the one who does it. Every age has its bell. In ours, we call it alignment, oversight, accountability. The question that emptied the council in the larder is the question that empties the conference hall now. Who exactly will tie the bell?